Most people think being poor means you do not have enough money. I do not think that is the real definition. A person can have a paycheck, a roof, a working car, and still be trapped in poverty in the deepest economic sense. Poverty is not merely a low number in a bank account. Poverty is a financial structure that keeps consuming your life faster than you can repair it. It is a system where effort goes in and pressure comes out. It is a treadmill that speeds up while pretending it is standing still. And if you do not understand that, you will spend years blaming your discipline, your luck, your confidence, your personality, or your coffee habits, when the real problem is much colder than that. The real problem is that you are playing by rules you did not design. I want to speak plainly today because I think too many hardworking people carry a kind of shame they do not deserve. They tell themselves they must be doing something wrong. They must not be focused enough. They must not be ambitious enough. They must not be waking up early enough. They must not be willing enough to grind. That is the language the modern world uses to keep people emotionally confused. It tells them the pain is personal, so they never examine the machinery. I have spent most of my life studying capital, businesses, compounding, incentives, and human behavior. And the longer I look, the more convinced I become that many ordinary people are not failing because they are lazy. They are failing because they are stuck inside a financial design that feeds on their exhaustion. That is not a dramatic statement. It is an accounting statement. The modern economy does not actually require you to become financially independent in order to function. Quite often it works best when you are almost independent, but not quite. Stable enough to keep showing up, tired enough to keep obeying, anxious enough to stay agreeable, too stretched to walk away. That is the sweet spot for many institutions. And if you want to escape it, you need more than motivation. You need to understand the architecture. That is where I want to begin. Not with slogans, with structure. There are 3 traps that quietly keep millions of people poor, even while they work hard, stay out of trouble, and try to act like responsible adults. The first trap is what I call the biological time equation. The second is the saver's punishment. The third is the ego tax. If you do not understand those 3 things, then almost every other piece of financial advice you hear will float around uselessly in your head, like furniture in a flooded house. It will sound helpful. It will not save you. Let us start with the first trap. From the time you are very young, the world trains you to believe one basic equation: give time, receive money. That sounds so natural, people almost never question it. You go to school. You behave, you get a credential, you get a job, you trade hours for wages. If you want more money, you are told to work more hours, gain a promotion, collect some overtime, or push yourself into a slightly better paying version of the same arrangement. The whole thing sounds orderly. It is also a trap. Now, I am not saying wages are worthless. I like wages. Wages are how most people begin. Wages can support a family. Wages can fund saving and investing. Wages can create the first layer of stability. But wages alone, especially when they are tied directly to your time and physical presence, carry a built-in ceiling that most people do not fully appreciate. There are only 24 hours in a day. That is not motivational language. That is physics. You do not get to negotiate with it. You need sleep, you need transport, you need meals, you need ordinary recovery and maintenance just to remain biologically functional enough to sell your labor again tomorrow. So the amount of time you can sell is inherently limited. That means your income, if it depends purely on the sale of your time, is also inherently limited. A lot of people respond to that by saying they will simply work harder. That is the first mistake. Harder is not the same as freer. Harder can mean more exhausted, more dependent, more brittle, and more valuable to an employer for precisely as long as you remain healthy and obedient. Then one day your body gets sick, or your parent gets ill, or your child needs you, or the company restructures, or the department disappears, or someone younger will do 90% of your job for 80% of your pay. Then the equation reveals what it always was. You are not building leverage, you are renting yourself. That is a very different position. Most workers are not paid according to how hard they try. They are paid according to the market value of what they do and how easily they can be replaced. That can sound brutal, but pretending otherwise will not help you. A person can be sincere, exhausted, loyal, punctual, and still be economically weak if the market sees his role as widely replaceable. The market is not your parent. It does not award moral medals. It prices output. That is all. If a business can replace you in 30 days with minimal damage, Your economic leverage is low, no matter how committed you feel. That does not make you worthless as a human being. It means your position inside the market is weaker than you may have admitted. This is why I say the biological time equation is so dangerous. It convinces people they are moving forward because they are active. It tells them labor intensity is the same thing as financial advancement. It is not. Sometimes labor intensity is only a more expensive way of staying in place. And if that sounds harsh, look around. How many people do you know who are working very hard and still feel one broken transmission, one medical deductible, or one missed week of wages away from trouble? That is not an effort problem. That is a structure problem. I want you to imagine two men standing over the same pile of earth. One has a shovel. One has an excavator. The man with the shovel may sweat more. He may be nobler in the eyes of people who romanticize struggle. He may go home sore enough to feel he truly earned the day. The man with the excavator may sit down, move a few controls, and shift 10 or 20 times as much earth. The world does not pay according to sweat. It pays according to output and leverage. That is one of the oldest truths in capitalism. The poor are often encouraged to admire effort because admiration of effort keeps them busy. The wealthy focus on leverage because leverage changes the equation. Leverage is not always debt. Debt is one form, and often a dangerous one. The most beautiful forms of leverage are code, systems, media, ownership, brands, distribution, capital itself, and assets that keep working while you sleep. If you write a useful piece of software once, it can serve thousands or millions of users. If you build a business system that sells while you are not in the room, it decouples some of your income from your physical presence. If you own shares in productive businesses, their work continues whether you are awake or not. That is leverage. And unless a person moves at least part of his financial life from labor into leverage, he remains trapped inside the biological time equation, no matter how respectable his work ethic looks from the outside. This is one reason I get impatient with all the modern grinding sermons. Wake up at 4, do more, want it harder, push more. None of that is inherently wrong. Discipline matters, ambition matters, but more intensity inside a bad equation does not produce freedom. It produces a sharper version of dependence. The real question is not whether you are willing to work hard. The real question is whether your work is helping you escape the equation or simply survive inside it a little longer. That is a very different question. If you are working from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, and every bit of that effort still disappears into the same fixed obligations with no growing ownership and no scalable output, then you are not building a financial life. You are servicing one. This is where most people need to become brutally honest. What part of my life earns only when I show up? What part keeps earning after I leave? What part is labor? What part is leverage? What part is ownership? What part is rent? I pay to the system simply for being alive. Until you divide your life that way, you will keep treating all income as equal. It is not equal. A dollar earned once by your back is not the same as a dollar earned by an asset that can keep producing. One is survival. The other is the beginning of escape. Now let us go to the second trap, because even the people who do manage to save something often fall into it without noticing. The saver's punishment. This one is quieter, which makes it more effective. A person works hard maybe harder than he should. He finally learns to spend a little less. He cuts some habits. He tries to be responsible. He opens the banking app and sees a balance building. This is where society begins flattering him. Good, responsible, prudent, safe. You are doing the right thing, perhaps. But what is the money doing while it sits there? That is the question adults should ask. Most people are taught that a bank account is safety. In one sense it is. If you need immediate liquidity, operating cash matters. I am not against reserves. I love reserves. I dislike fragility. But there is a huge difference between necessary liquidity and long-term wealth storage. Those are not the same job. Modern money is not gold buried in a box. It is fiat currency. It is state-backed paper and digital claims inside a system that can create more of itself whenever the pressure becomes politically or financially convenient enough. That matters. Because once you understand that, you understand why idle cash can slowly become a kind of invisible victim. People think theft must look like someone taking their wallet. They do not realize there is a quieter form of theft. The number stays the same. The purchasing power shrinks. The life energy stored in the balance leaks away, while the owner still feels responsible for having saved it. That is a very sophisticated kind of punishment. A person does what he was told. He works, he saves, he refrains, he delays gratification, then the system expands the money supply, runs deficits, accommodates debt, and allows prices to drift upward over time. The saver still sees the same number on the screen, and his brain tells him he is intact. Then he goes to buy shelter, healthcare, education, food, insurance, or the ordinary components of adult life, and realizes the money now buys less. He was not robbed in a dramatic sense, he was deluded, and dilution is one of the cleanest ways a system can shift wealth from the cautious to the asset owner without starting a riot. This is why the wealthy do not sit around worshiping cash. They may hold it for flexibility, transaction needs, or tactical reasons, but they do not confuse it with the final resting place of wealth. They understand that currency is a claim, not an end state. It is a temporary medium, a bridge, not a destination. What they want are productive assets, real assets, businesses, land, intellectual property, ownership stakes, durable cash flows, things that can adjust, earn, rise, or at least resist dilution better than paper claims sitting passively in the wrong place. This is another point where the public gets tricked by labels. Safe, safe for what? Safe for paying next month's rent. Fine, safe for preserving purchasing power over a decade. Much more questionable. Safe for growing richer. Not likely, words like safe need context. Without context, they become lullabies. And lullabies are dangerous in finance. If you keep too much of your life in cash for too long, the system taxes you invisibly through inflation and opportunity cost. The opportunity cost matters just as much as the inflation, because the money did not merely lose purchasing power. It also failed to become something more productive in the meantime. That double loss is how people stay stuck while feeling responsible. Now, I do not want to be misunderstood. I am not telling people to put every dollar in the market and live with zero reserves. That would be idiotic. An emergency fund is not laziness. It is anti-panic infrastructure. A person who has no liquidity will often make much worse decisions than a person with modest liquidity and a good long-term plan. The problem is not cash itself. The problem is using cash as a substitute for investment, because investment feels uncertain and cash feels emotionally comforting. Comfort is expensive when it prevents productive ownership. That is the saver's punishment. The person thinks he is being conservative. The system interprets him as someone willing to hold the least productive form of capital while better assets drift away from him. This is why I have always preferred ownership. Own a farm, not just the grain receipt. Own the business, not just the wages from the business. Own the cash flow, not just the currency. Own the machine, not just your job beside the machine. That is how you move out of the saver's punishment and into actual wealth building. Now let us come to the third trap, because this is where the middle class does some of its most tragic damage, the ego tax. This one is not enforced by law. It is much more effective than law because it is enforced by insecurity. The public has a deep need to look successful, not necessarily to become strong. To look successful, that distinction explains a great deal. The system understands this perfectly. If you cannot yet be wealthy, the system will gladly sell you the appearance of wealth on installment. It will sell you the car, the wardrobe, the phone, the dining pattern, the upgraded apartment, the vacations, the social media version of life that whispers to strangers that you are doing well, and it will finance every bit of it. That is how the prison becomes self-decorated. People think debt is only a financial concept. It is also a psychological concept. A person buys what flatters his ego, then borrows against his own future labor to pay for it, then wakes up each month and goes to work partly to service the illusion. That is the ego tax. It is one of the cruelest mechanisms in the whole machine, because the victim often volunteers. He feels elevated for a brief moment, then obligated for years. Look at the modern car market. A person signs papers on a vehicle he cannot comfortably buy outright. The payment is manageable, which usually means it will not kill him immediately. That is what manageable means in consumer finance. Not smart, not optimal, just survivable enough that the contract can be sold. The car starts depreciating right away. The loan does not. Insurance rises, repairs will one day rise. The person has effectively purchased a rapidly declining asset with borrowed money, while telling himself he deserves something nicer because he works hard. That is not wealth. That is emotional spending financed by future labor. Now multiply that logic across many categories: clothes, phones, furniture, trips, restaurants used as status theater, private school choices made without real arithmetic, housing upgrades done because the neighborhood flatteries felt irresistible. All of it becomes one giant monthly tribute paid to appearance. What makes this so destructive is that appearance has no residual value. A productive asset can keep paying you. A well-run business can compound. A good piece of land can protect purchasing power. A strong brand can earn for years. An ego purchase produces the opposite effect. It takes a future stream of money and converts it into a temporary feeling. That is an ugly exchange rate. The rich are often understood very badly by the public here. People think wealth looks like visible luxury. Sometimes it does. But the more reliable form of wealth is what you do not see. The debt not carried, the car not upgraded, the second house not purchased, the cash flow not exposed to permanent lifestyle inflation, the investment account funded instead of the applause account. Real wealth is often invisible because it is still in the productive stage. The person driving the plain car with no consumer debt and a growing stack of productive assets may be much richer than the person driving the luxury vehicle financed to his eyebrows. One looks rich, one is rich. Those are different categories. The system is happy when you confuse them, because if you chase the look, you will keep feeding banks, lenders, advertisers, brands, and every institution that profits from insecurity. But if you chase actual ownership, the whole relationship changes. You become harder to control. That is why the ego tax matters so much. It is not only about overspending, it is about sacrificing future freedom to maintain social illusion. And once you see that clearly, a lot of ordinary consumer culture begins looking very strange. People are paying enormous sums to look like the kind of person who does not need to pay enormous sums to feel legitimate. That is a sad loop. Now, if you put all three traps together, the picture becomes very clear. First, you are told to sell time for money and to treat that as the whole game. Second, you are told to save the leftover cash in a way that lets inflation and opportunity cost slowly hollow it out. Third, when the gap between what you feel and what you want becomes too painful, you are offered debt, financed symbols to preserve your dignity while your real balance sheet weakens. That is the machine. It is not a conspiracy in the cartoon sense. It is more cold than that. It is a set of incentives that happen to work beautifully for the institutions upstream and terribly for the people downstream, unless the downstream people learn the math. That is why knowledge matters so much. Not motivational knowledge, operational knowledge. How do you escape the time equation? How do you move cash into productive assets? How do you stop funding appearance and start funding independence? Those are the questions that matter. And if I had to reduce the whole escape into practical steps, I would say the process begins with stopping the bleeding. That has to come first. People love to discuss the glamorous step before they have handled the emergency step. They want to talk about ETFs, cash flow, leverage, financial freedom, dividend income, and early retirement, while they still have 18 or 24% credit card debt quietly chewing on their future. No. The first job is triage. If the balance sheet is infected with high-interest consumer poison, kill it. Do not philosophize about it. Do not soften it with language. Do not call it optimizing. Kill it. That means cut the ego tax first. Sell what can be sold. Stop financing appearance. Stop buying the version of yourself you wanted strangers to believe in. That version is expensive and unhelpful. Use the money to remove the toxic debt, because toxic debt is not just expensive. It destroys optionality. Every month you carry it, you are giving away future choice. And choice is one of the finest forms of wealth available. Once the poison is gone, build the buffer. Not a giant pile of dead cash, a rational operating reserve, enough to stop ordinary life from knocking you back into the arms of consumer lenders. 3 months, 6 months, more, if the life is unstable. This is not idle money. This is anti-panic money. That distinction matters. Then begin the shift from labor to leverage. This is where people get confused, because they assume leverage must mean borrowing. It does not. Leverage can mean skill, software, media. A service with scale, a business system, a skill set the market pays disproportionately because it is rare and hard to replace. Leverage is anything that allows effort to travel further than your immediate presence. A writer with 1 million readers has leverage. A programmer with software used by thousands has leverage. An owner of productive businesses has leverage. A worker whose income exists only while he is physically present has much less of it. So the question becomes, what can you build or learn that scales? Not what sounds impressive. What scales? What can keep paying, helping, selling, or producing after the first effort is already done. This is why I would rather see a person spend his nights building a system than spend them scrolling through people, pretending to live the life he thinks money buys. The one thing builds escape. The other thing reinforces the ego tax. Then, when a surplus finally appears, do not let it sleep uselessly or leak back into appearances. Convert it. Buy productive assets, broad low-cost index funds, strong businesses, real estate when the economics truly work. Things that produce, things that can rise with inflation, things that shift your life from one where money comes only from labor to one where money begins arriving from ownership. That is the whole transition. Not instant wealth, a change in the source. And once the source changes, life changes with it. A person with no consumer debt, reserves in place, a rising skill set, and regular asset purchases is not merely richer than he was. He is becoming harder to frighten. That matters. The employers have less control. The monthly shocks have less power. The temptation to fake success through consumption becomes less interesting because real strength starts replacing performance. That is what I want for people. Not hype, not moral lectures about grinding, not rented confidence, structure. A structure that makes them increasingly difficult to trap. Now, let me say something that many people need to hear. This is hard, very hard. The system is not easy to escape because it knows where your weaknesses are. It knows you want relief, it knows you want comfort, it knows you want to feel successful before you actually are. It knows you are tired after work and more likely to confuse convenience with value. It knows you will tell yourself small indulgences do not matter while large obligations quietly harden around you. It knows all of that. So do not expect the escape to feel glamorous. It will often feel like reduction, like saying no, like looking less polished than people who are actually financing their own image through future stress. That is fine. The point is not to look rich. The point is to become financially independent enough that the room loses the power to tell you who you must pretend to be. That is a better destination. A much better one. If you understand the biological time equation, the saver's punishment, and the ego tax, then you stop blaming yourself in the useless way and start taking responsibility in the useful way. That is a very important distinction. I do not want people carrying shame. Shame is heavy and unproductive. I want them carrying clarity. Clarity says the machine is real, the traps are real, and the escape is possible. But only if I stop participating in the parts that keep me weak. That is something a person can act on. He can cut consumer debt. He can build reserves. He can learn leverage. He can buy ownership. He can refuse appearances. He can route future surplus into assets instead of signals. That is how lives change. Quietly first, then obviously. And that is another truth people do not appreciate until later. The early stage of escape rarely looks impressive. It looks smaller, plainer, almost dull. The car is less flashy. The spending is calmer. The social proof is weaker. The applause is lower. Then one day the obligations are lighter, the reserves are real, the assets are paying, and the person who once looked ordinary is suddenly the one who can walk away. That is when people call it discipline. Sometimes they call it luck. Usually it was architecture. I trust architecture more than motivation. That is why I wanted to explain this without the usual motivational smoke. You do not need another speech telling you to grind harder. You need to know why hard work without leverage, cash without productive deployment, and success, signaling through debt, can keep a person poor for life. Once you know that, the world begins looking different. The trap does not disappear, but it becomes visible. Visible traps are easier to avoid than invisible ones. That is a very good beginning, and a beginning with clarity is worth more than 1,000 borrowed speeches about hustle. Because hustle without design is just expensive motion. Design changes outcomes. That is what I would want any hardworking person to understand before he gives the next decade of his life away to the wrong machine.